Republican of Florida. Let's begin with the news out of Washington. What do you think about Paul Ryan? Should he be the next speaker? Will you support him?
I think Paul Ryan is an intellectual giant in our party. He would be a great face of the party. He is a natural leader and somebody that can unite the party. Paul Ryan's not yet a speaker candidate, though. He made very clear yesterday he is not a candidate for speaker unless the House agrees to certain conditions that he made. I endorsed Dan Webster very early in the speaker's race. Dan still has my very strong support. I think Dan Webster would be a great speaker for this moment in time for our party, for the Congress, and for the nation. Should Paul Ryan ultimately receive the nomination of the conference, I would be excited to vote for Paul Ryan as our next speaker on the House floor. Until then, I intend to continue to support Dan Webster.
And Dan Webster's still in the race. He is a declared candidate for this.
He is. He may be the only declared candidate at this point.
Jason Chaffetz dropping out, who was going to be seeking it when Kevin McCarthy was also speaking it. He tweeted out yesterday he's out supporting Paul Ryan. What do you make of the conditions laid out by Representative Ryan?
It's an interesting position to give a speech saying, I want your vote for speaker, but only if you do the following things. From class president, speaker of the House, normally it's I'm running to do the following things, and this is why I'm asking for your support. Look, Paul Ryan is a great person with universal respect throughout the conference. He clearly is coming into this not certain he wants the job. His focus is rightfully on his family. It's one of the reasons so many people respect him. He loves his position at Ways and Means. But he understands there's a certain pull right now that perhaps the country needs him. And perhaps this is the time for his leadership. And he has such a moral character that he's willing to consider that pull. Now, I will tell you, I don't know if the caucus gets there by Friday. Paul was pretty clear. He said, these are the things I'm not going to do. These are the things I need you to do, and you've got until Friday to let me know. It was a fascinating dynamic in the room. I will tell you, there are a lot of people who support Paul Ryan and a lot of people who want to support Paul Ryan. If he can bring together those two coalitions by Friday, those who already support him and those who want to support him, he might be the next Speaker of the House. I continue to introduce my colleagues in the country to Dan Webster. Listen, Dan is a former Speaker of the House of the state of Florida, a conservative who actually has been endorsed by the Freedom Caucus, but not a member of the Freedom Caucus. A conservative endorsed by some from the Tuesday group as well. A former Speaker of the House that worked with a Democratic governor to govern, to get things done. For me, the only test of leadership in our next Speaker is who will commit to governing. Why haven't we done a border security and immigration reform bill on the House floor? Why don't we have a multi-year transportation bill? Why do we get to September 30th with no long-term budget? Why are we facing all these critical issues that we refuse to deal with? The American people aren't upset that we've done border security and immigration and they don't like what's in it. They're upset that we haven't even tried. I joke we've gone from a do-nothing Congress to a try-nothing Congress. The test of leadership in our next Speaker is somebody committed to getting back to governing. That's why I support Dan Webster. I believe Paul Ryan would bring the same conviction if he's our next Speaker.
Dan Webster, how many votes does he have?
I don't know how many votes he has. We never had the opportunity for the first vote because it was canceled shortly after Kevin stepped out. I think we would have gotten probably to 60 or 70 on the first ballot. There is a caucus that had endorsed him and I understand would vote universally. So that would have been about 40. I know we had picked up probably about 20 elsewhere, so it would have been a strong number for Dan on the first ballot.
The dynamic in the room last night, you mentioned that. Drudge Report this morning had a banner earlier, it's not up there anymore, King Ryan, about his conditions, that he's coming to them. What do you make of him saying, I'll take this if you agree to change the rules that allow a motion to vacate the chair?
Well, I don't know that it's just that motion. So there are several rule changes that he wants people to agree to. There are several conditions upon which he does not want to entertain other suggestions from others in the party. He also said something last night that I vehemently disagree with. He said he does not believe it would be appropriate to do a comprehensive border security and immigration bill before next November, while we have a president that, in his words, he doesn't believe we can trust as a negotiating partner on immigration reform. I respect that in Paul, and we don't agree on everything, and it's true of Dan Webster as well. And so it doesn't mean that I couldn't support him for Speaker. But that was a concern of mine. He basically laid out, here are the things that I want to do, here are the things I won't agree to, here are the things I won't do. Now you all go decide if you can accept that or not. It was an interesting dynamic. I know some have trouble with his notion that he wants to eliminate or change the motion to vacate the chair. Look, Paul is going to do this on his own terms, and I don't blame him for that. He never sought out this job. People came to him and have encouraged him to step up and lead. I understand why he wants to put conditions on it, and I respect Paul.
On immigration, that's an issue that divides people over Paul Ryan because they say he was part of a broader group trying to seek consensus on immigration.
Sure.
You're seeking a higher office, running for Senate in Florida. Are you for a pathway to citizenship?
Not for a pathway to citizenship, no, and here's why. We have people in the country legally on certain visas that have contributed to the economy, the culture, the foundation of our communities across the country for decades. They themselves do not have a pathway to citizenship. And so in the broad spectrum of 11 million people who are here without documentation, I will tell you there are some who have egregiously broken the law, who have violated the law, intended to violate the law, some who have already been given removal orders. They should be responsibly removed and, in fact, instructed on how to come to the country legally. There are those within the 11 million, though, who came here with no act of volition on their own, no mens rea, no culpability, perhaps as a 6-month-old. That's a very different situation. Should there be a pathway to some type of legal status? Probably so. My point on immigration reform is we have to deal with it. I don't know how it turns out, and I understand the political consequence of this. This is an issue that deeply divides the country. But I would rather serve in Congress having tackled hard issues and risk my own political future knowing we actually did something, we reached consensus, than to do nothing between now and next November simply for the sake of our own political fortune. It's the wrong spirit of service to suggest we're going to do nothing simply to get reelected. I'd rather put it on the House floor, let the House work its will for the next 3 weeks, deliver a product to the American people. I think it'd be a fairly conservative bill.
Before we get to calls, are you for raising the debt ceiling, a clean debt ceiling increase?
So the most conservative principle of all is paying your debts. We don't have a choice whether or not to pay our debts. We have taken on this debt. We have to pay it. I hope what we get in the next couple of weeks are some type of concessions for long-term debt reduction. You know, there's a proposal out there now that would achieve $4 trillion in savings over the next 10 years in return for raising it by $1.5 trillion, raising the debt limit by $1.5 trillion.
How would you get the savings to $4 trillion? What's the proposal?
So in the current budget, there are actually instructions to each committee to report out bills that achieve savings. So right now, those savings aren't identified, but the notion would be we have to achieve $4 trillion in the next 9 years in savings in return for increasing the debt limit today by $1.5 trillion. Look, it would be irresponsible not to pay our debts. When the president, however, suggests the only thing he'll sign is a clean debt ceiling, that's irresponsible as well. If we do not address the long-term drivers of our debt, then we are going to ensure an economic and fiscal collapse that ultimately undermines our own national security by ensuring that we are no longer the world's superpower.
We're talking with Representative David Jolly, Republican of Florida. He is endorsing and supporting Representative Daniel Webster, his colleague from his home state, for Speaker, and also a candidate for Senate, seeking to replace Marco Rubio, who's leaving that seat, of course, as all of you know, to run for president. Chuck, you're up first in Tucson, Arizona, Republican. Hi, Chuck.
Thank you for taking my call. I do appreciate C-SPAN. The question that I have for the guest is, why is it that the conservatives are always the ones that are supposed to be demanded to compromise? What part of the I guess there's no other caucus besides the Freedom Caucus and the Tea Party, but it's the other ones. Are they going to have to do any compromising at all?
Well, I appreciate that question, Chuck. You know, there are several caucuses within the House, and frankly, I think sometimes too many. We should be one united party. But I will tell you that there is a lot of compromise from folks who I call the governing caucus. Listen, I go back to the president's immigration executive amnesty orders. I opposed each one of those. I was one of 18 members of the House to introduce legislation with my colleague Ted Yoho to invalidate them. I voted to defund them. We fought the fight, but we lost. Harry Reid wouldn't pass them through the Senate, and the president wouldn't sign them. So we came to a critical vote earlier this year, I believe around March, where we had to vote whether or not to keep the government open or not. We fought the fight. But at the end of the day, there are only about 80 or 90 of us who actually accepted the responsibility to govern and to keep the government open. That's a hard political vote for folks like myself, but understand it's the responsible vote. It's the governing vote. And so I would say there's actually a lot of compromise going on already. I know what's happened within as you mentioned, the Freedom Caucus. They have decided that this might just be the hill they want to die on to extract the changes that they are demanding. Listen, they have enough votes to frankly topple the Speaker and to stop the operations of the House floor. They are running a risk by marginalizing their own caucus and forcing a coalition government that only empowers Nancy Pelosi. The most ironic thing that could come out of this is that the Freedom Caucus, who is so stringent in their demands, might actually empower the hand of Nancy Pelosi. I will tell you this, I think this is a great time for our party. When people discuss the House is in chaos and so forth, I disagree. This is exactly the family moment we need to have as a party. We are one party. We are all conservatives in this caucus. The question is, how do we govern as conservatives? And I think we'll solve that in the coming weeks.
The Wall Street Journal this morning weighs in on Paul Ryan, and they say he can lead, but will enough Republicans follow? Sure. The Wall Street Journal editorial board writing this. The other problem beyond Mr. Ryan's control is that some of the right want the GOP Congress to fail because it serves their political or commercial interests. The clearest example is Ted Cruz, the Texas senator whose campaign for the White House, and especially his strategy to win the Iowa caucuses, is premised on attacking the GOP Congress. Do you agree?
I absolutely agree with that. Listen, we have a cottage industry right down the street here who pledge their allegiance to an ideological litmus test that can never be met, and then use that litmus test or scorecard to divide our own party and to raise money off of it. And these are the politics of division. Politics of division are on both sides of the aisle. What I know is we can accomplish conservative policy results, actually accomplish things by governing. Not by shutting down the government, but by governing. I would ask the folks who continue to pursue this strategy of dividing us, of the my way or the highway, shut everything down if they don't get their own way, point to one result, one legislative accomplishment they've achieved through that tactic. There is none. I'd rather work with them to achieve conservative reforms, actually through governing, keeping the government open. The notion that 3/4 of a loaf is better than none, let's pursue that for the next year and a half, and we'll have a very good November as Republicans.
Wouldn't those conservatives point to less spending in the past few years since
Sure.
they were in Congress, and also to sequestration, which many of them think should stay in place?
Sure. Understand, we are in an environment where spending continues to come down on the discretionary side, the operations of government. The operations of government, the cost has reduced from about $1.4 trillion to $1.16 trillion in the last 5 years. That's a significant reduction. It's good. That's right. Let's declare a small victory on that and say, how do we keep it going? The next issue is the long-term cost drivers, which are your mandatory spending entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt. That is the part that has not yet been resolved, and that is the part where we finally need to achieve consensus.
Beverly's next in South Holland, Illinois, Democrat. Hi, Beverly.
Hi, good morning. How you doing?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, Representative Jolly, I've listened to you say governing. For the last 7 years up under this president, and please don't cut me off, I'm not going bad towards this man, but I thought when the American people, whether we elect you or not, once we elect you all, you're supposed to come together as one body, Democrats and Republicans, and work together with this president to help this country. This president won this presidency twice legitimately. Why should he always have to compromise with you guys? You all didn't win. But what I'm saying to you, come together and work for the general public, who is us. We are paying your salaries. We want you to get in there. If you don't agree with the president, okay, but work with him. If he don't agree with you, he's supposed to work with you. But all you all have been doing for the last 7 years, and the record show is saying no. How can one person, everything he asked you to do is no? How could that be possible? You all have worked with Democrat presidents before.
Okay, and Beverly, Congressman Jolly's shaking his head, so let's give him a chance.
I am, Beverly. I think you should run for Speaker of the House because you and I are talking about exactly the same thing. We have a responsibility to govern. Now, I want to be fair and point out a couple things. The House passed about 300 pieces of legislation last year that Harry Reid, as the majority leader of the Senate, killed. He said no, completely. We couldn't get anything to the president's desk because the obstructionism is actually on both sides of the aisle. It truly is. And I often say, you know, the dysfunction, the dishonesty, the manipulation is on both sides of the aisle. I call it out on my side of the aisle just like I do on the other side of the aisle. But you hit on something very important, Beverly. We are elected to govern. If we would drop the R's and the D's sometimes, the answers are just within reach. You know, 80 to 90% of what we do in government in the United States Congress should not be political. Frankly, we're talking about the basic operations of a government. We should be reaching consensus. We all bring certain ideological convictions. I certainly do myself. At the end of the day, you work as hard as you can to advance those. But if we do nothing to reach consensus, then we've accomplished nothing. Beverly, I fully agree with you, and I appreciate that phone call.
Congressman David Jolly serving in a second term, elected in March of 2014 during a special election to fill the seat of the late Representative Bill Young, Republican of Florida, 13th District, serves on the Transportation Subcommittee for the Appropriations Panel. Jan, and did we just talk to Jan in Port Huron, Michigan, Republican? Jan, are you next?
No, not yet.
All right, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to make a comment. I'm not for Paul Ryan as becoming Speaker. His heart's not in it. He doesn't really want the job. He's not really our only choice. Have we looked outside of the box and thought of maybe the best Speaker of the House we've ever had in 50 years, bringing in Newt Gingrich as the interim Speaker? He has nothing to prove to anybody. He'll be fair. He's tough, but fair. He knows how to compromise. He knows how to work with both sides of the aisle. And until the next election, he might be our true answer of getting things accomplished.
Congressman?
I appreciate that. You point out something very important. The Speaker of the House does not have to be a member of Congress. You know, you mentioned Paul Ryan's heart. It might not be in it. I will tell you, within the room last night, and I know you saw on TV as well, it's clear he doesn't want the job. He has said that before. This is a time where he is rising to the occasion on behalf of the American people to do what's right. But that is a legitimate question going into the next 3 months of what will be very significantly complex political turmoil between the White House and the Congress, whether or not he really wants to take that on. We will see what happens. I will tell you this, if Paul Ryan ultimately is not the nominee come Friday, we have a tough couple of weeks ahead of us. I don't believe there is anybody in the caucus other than Paul Ryan that can get to 218 votes. And understand, that's okay. That might actually be a good thing, because I continue to suggest that we should have multiple ballots behind closed doors within the Republican conference as long as it takes to get a consensus of 218, so that when we come out of those closed doors and go to the House floor, we know who our nominee is and there are no more distractions. Paul Ryan will know by Friday. If it's not Paul Ryan, believe it or not, I think John Boehner's here until Thanksgiving. The ultimate irony in what some would call this coup or this effort to take down John Boehner might actually result in him staying on a little bit longer.
And Paul Ryan wants more than 218 votes, right?
He certainly does. And you look, Paul Ryan's the one person that might actually get to a unanimous vote. I'm not sure he can do that after last night's meeting. The conditions that he laid out there just might be too tough for some people to swallow.
What was the dynamic in the room? You alluded to it earlier, but...
You know, listen, there was a lot of applause. There was a lot of applause. There was a lot of support, recognizing that this is somebody who, at great sacrifice to his family, he is willing to do the job. The conditions came off kind of tough, to be honest. I mean, the thing about a coronation is you don't get to demand it. And so there's an interesting dynamic right now. We will decide as a party over the next several days, do we embrace Paul as our next nominee or not? I don't blame him for having the conditions. I absolutely don't. I fully respect it. I continue to support Dan Webster, but we've got two great candidates in Dan and Paul.
Did he take any questions? He took 4 from reporters.
He did not. No, he did not take any questions.
So what was he was introduced by the Speaker?
The Speaker introduced Paul. Paul stood up and talked about how interesting the last 10 days have been, and then talked about how the most important things to him are his family, his church, and his tree stand. And over the past 10 days, he consulted with each one of them and came down out of the tree stand having written...
For hunting.
For hunting, right? Kind of came down out of the tree stand with the speech he wanted to deliver to the conference yesterday, diagnosed what he considered the problems within the party and the caucus are, and what he expressed is, look, he thinks we're really at a point in history where we either turn the tide back on the president's very progressive agenda or we don't. And the reason he wants to step into the job is he believes, with conviction, as I do, that the president's agenda has been wrong for the future of the country, both in domestic policy and foreign policy. There's a sharp divide between a party today whose frontrunner in New Hampshire is a registered socialist and what all conservatives believe in. That is this contest of ideas we call politics. It's why Paul has such conviction that perhaps he needs to serve.
Republicans will again gather behind closed doors in less than an hour. What's on the agenda for this meeting?
So my understanding is we're going to walk through kind of the next 6 weeks and what it's going to look like. Understand we have debt limit, we have an expiring transportation bill, we have a continuing resolution that has to get resolved to keep the government open. We're looking at a tax reform package, and we're looking at what happens with Export-Import Bank reauthorization. This is going to be a very tricky next 6 weeks. And with no disrespect to the president, he has dug in his heels and basically said he's not going to negotiate on anything. He understands that he holds a lot of leverage right now. We are without a leader. The president has the ability to blame us for shutting down the government. I believe it's irresponsible every time he does that, but that's the landscape. So we're going to be talking at 9 o'clock about how we navigate the next 6 weeks.
All right, more to come. Karen in Ohio, Independent.
Hi.
Morning, you're on the air.
Good morning.
So just a couple of things. I want to go back a little bit to when you talked about immigration, and I heard you mention that there are immigrants here already that don't have a pathway. That wouldn't be fair for the illegal immigrants to get a pathway, and I just don't understand, first of all, what you mean by that, and second of all, the pathway that this plan is laying out has a lot of really almost impossible things for these illegal immigrants to try and do. I mean, just the money alone that they would have to come up with, for back taxes or for whatever you guys call. Anyway, it's difficult for them to come up with it. Plus, it would still take a lot of time. And what do you mean by immigrants that are here don't have a pathway?
Sure. So listen, we are a loving and caring nation made better by immigration. We should embrace legal immigration, but we're also a nation of laws. And I understand the challenges and the hurdles in some of the bills that have been out there, Marco Rubio's in particular. It took many years and much reparations, but understand these are individuals who did break the law at one point, and so we have to responsibly address that. But let me tell you what I'm talking about for those here legally, because I actually introduced legislation to try to reform and make more efficient our legal immigration process. We have a visa program right now, I believe it's the E2 visa program, where a family can move here, a couple can move here, open up a business, and employ at least, I believe, 2 people. Now, this is very different than the high finance investor visa. This is, in my community, a couple that runs a florist, a man who runs a French bakery, somebody else who has a restaurant, somebody who has a commercial landscaping business. They come to the United States under a 5-year visa that they can continue to renew. They have kids here. Their kids go to our schools. When their kids hit 21, they have to go to back to a home country perhaps they've never lived in because they age out. The couple that is here running the florist business, the moment they close their doors, they're not allowed to stay here. They don't have a pathway to permanent residency in the United States. It's a condition of their visa. So they may be in the United States 20, 25, 30 years. They hit a retirement age of 60 or 65, and under our current law, they are forced to return home to a country that they haven't lived in for 30, 35 years. They've invested in the fabric of our community, and we suggest they now have no pathway and no legal status to remain in the United States. So why do I oppose a pathway to citizenship for those who have broken the law, those who are here illegally? It's because if the Hayes family in my district does not have a pathway, somebody who has done it legally for decades, if they don't have a pathway, we can't begin to consider creating a pathway to those who have actually broken the law. The bottom line is we need to put all this on the House floor and legislate. We need to get back to a government that governs. As I mentioned, I don't know how that debate turns out and what that comprehensive package looks like, but we will be better off as a country for having finally addressed it than what we're doing right now, which is not addressing it. And under Speaker Ryan, if he is the next speaker, what he said last night, there's no intent to address it between now and next November. I strongly disagree with that.
All right, we'll go to Florida. Clearwater. Douglas, a Democrat. Good morning, Douglas.
Good morning, Greta, and Jolly is my representative.
Hey, Douglas.
And you can save that one. The comments you made about Charlie Crist yesterday were that was not very. That's the problem with you Republicans. You don't know how to talk nice. You don't know how to be diplomatic. You don't know how to be gracious, even in defeat. Those comments were outrageous, what you said about him. He's a fellow Floridian, by the way, and all he's ever done was hug the president. And I think that's a big problem. And I'm really tired of this both sides of the issue nonsense as well. I mean, whenever there's a president in office, you never hear about the government being shut down when Democrats are actually running things. And it's always about the Republicans. Then you try to twist it around and say, oh, the president's doing. You're talking out both sides of your neck with that nonsense. And you get caught off guard all the time because a lot of your members will say, well, we're going to shut down the government. And you ignore all that stuff. And you conservatives talk about spending, just like in Florida, this whole redistricting thing. It's cost more than $11 million already for you guys, for these guys in the state of Florida to do something they should have done in the first place. Do the right districting, and you wouldn't be in office if that were the case. But you spend money on nonsense. 7 committees already about Benghazi. You're going to Hillary Clinton's emails. What, did she betray some trade secrets or something? Now you got 4 committees with this Planned Parenthood nonsense, and everyone knows those are fictitious videos. And you hold votes that you know are going nowhere. 50-some-odd times you want to talk about Obamacare, and while you're not getting anything done about the infrastructure, you're not doing anything about the unemployed, you're not doing anything that matters.
Okay, and Douglas, a lot on the table there for the Congressman to respond to.
So, Douglas, thank you for calling. Let me talk about some areas we agree. We should be doing a multi-year transportation infrastructure bill that's fully paid for. I've been asking for that. Frankly, I started voting against the short-term extenders because I think it's irresponsible for us to do that. You mentioned having 4 committees investigating Planned Parenthood. I think that's too many. Listen, I disagree very seriously with what I saw on the Planned Parenthood videos. It shocked my conscience like it did many. But as Republicans, we're either the party of less bureaucracy or we're not. I was the only Republican to vote against a special committee on Planned Parenthood because we already have 3 doing the job. We should narrow it to 1, not add a 4th. So I agree with you on that as well.
On Benghazi committee?
On Benghazi,
too much?
On Benghazi, here's why I voted to authorize the Benghazi committee. I was leaning no about a week prior to it. And then we found out going into the vote that the administration had provided more information to a Freedom of Information Act request from an outside group than they had provided to the Congress. That level of distrust and obstruction from the White House is why I voted to support the Benghazi committee. Now listen, let me address something though. I don't apologize for my comments about Charlie Crist. I think my comments reflected the frustration of people across the state who don't know if he's a Republican, an independent, or a Democrat. I'll also tell you this. This is a man who in 1997 walked into Bill Young's office while I was there and suggested Bill Young was too old to serve, suggested Bill Young should resign and retire, and endorse Charlie Crist because he was looking for another office to run for. When Bill Young refused to do that, Charlie Crist took on Bob Graham. This is a person who looks only to run for his own political future, and it's simply out of political convenience, not political conviction, and I will do everything I can to make sure that he is not the next member of Congress from Pinellas County.
He's running for your seat. You're vacating that seat to run for Senate. So the headline in TampaBay.com website, David Jolly crashes Charlie Crist's campaign kickoff. This was yesterday. Right. Charlie Crist, who was a Republican turned Democrat, saying that he will now seek this congressional seat after seeking a run. He ran for governor, ran for Senate as well. Elaine, speaking of Benghazi, though, I do want to let our viewers know that we will be covering the testimony of Hillary Clinton tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. That'll be on C-SPAN 3, C-SPAN Radio, cspan.org, and she's expected to be in the chair for hours, starting at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, so tune in then. Also, watch the Washington Journal leading up to that, because, of course, we'll be talking about it as well. Elaine, Clearwater, Florida, again, an independent. Hi, Elaine.
Hi.
Hi, Elaine.
I have a couple questions to ask you. First of all, well, this is not a question. If Obama thinks that Ryan is going to be great, then we're in trouble. Because anything Obama thinks is great is dangerous. Second, in our paper, the Tampa Bay Times, there was an article that you are looking into the HUD housing problem, and I live in HUD housing, and I understand just what you're looking for because I've seen it happening right here. And that's really all I have to say. Let me know how you're doing on this HUD housing thing.
Sure. Well, thank you for bringing that up. Listen, there has been an Inspector General report for HUD that has identified taxpayers are paying $104 million this coming year to provide HUD housing for families who are over the income threshold, so they should be financially disqualified. I'll give you a couple examples. A family in New York who made $500,000 last year is living in taxpayer-supported housing. A single individual, I believe in Nebraska, the Plain States, with $1.6 million in assets is paying $300 a month in rent in taxpayer-supported housing, while we have upwards of, I believe, 100,000 people on the waiting list who actually need the housing. So what I've demanded of HUD is that we identify a way to transition these over-income families out of HUD. Now understand, I'm not looking to disrupt these families by simply locking their doors tomorrow, but we should have a responsible transition in place over the next 6, 12, 18 months to begin to transition out over-income families so that we can create additional capacity for those who truly need it. You know, this seems like such a simple issue. Why waste $100 million on providing taxpayer-supported housing for families who don't need it? But I will tell you, sometimes in government it's like pushing a noodle to get people to listen and actually do what should be the easy stuff, the low-hanging stuff. So the reason I continue to stay on it is there's no gray area here. Let's stop wasting taxpayer dollars to provide housing for families who can provide it for themselves. That's a simple solution to this.
Cartersville, Georgia. Victor, a Democrat. Hi there.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey.
My question, I've got a question and a comment. What is meant by vacate the rule, changing the rule to vacate the chair? And I hope and pray that Congress get some sense and passes a clean bill this time. The way things have been going is utterly ridiculous, and it's pox on both houses.
Okay, Victor.
So on vacate the chair, you know, the House operates under a series of rules for debate and bringing up legislation, but there are a handful of what are called privileged resolutions or privileged actions, meaning any member of Congress at any time can demand a vote. A motion to adjourn, for instance, I believe is privileged. You can demand it any time. A motion to vacate the chair is to suggest that we are going to remove the Speaker from his position, his or her position. So meaning any member of Congress at any time, I could walk over there today and demand sometime in the next 48 hours under the rules, I forget the exact amount of time, but demand that we take a vote on removing the Speaker, and it only requires 51%. Paul Ryan is concerned that when we have a certain group right now that votes as a block of 40 people, that at any given moment they could actually topple the speakership. That's what they threatened to do to John Boehner over the summer. And so that's the motion to vacate. On the clean debt limit, listen, it is the conservative position to pay our bills. We will make sure that the bills are paid and that ultimately we address the issue. But I would hope in the next couple of weeks we also use this opportunity to address the long-term debt issues, the long-term drivers of our debt, that responsibly address how we got here. Otherwise, we're just looking the other way and moving on.
On this issue of a privileged resolution to vacate the chair, did Paul Ryan say last night he wants to remove that privilege altogether?
You know, he said de-weaponize was his word, and so I don't know exactly what he meant by that. There's been some chatter that perhaps you raise the vote threshold to a supermajority or 2/3 or 3/4. I don't know exactly what he meant by it, but he said he would want the caucus to remove that leverage if he were to accept the speakership.
Rule changes, is that also on a meeting agenda coming up?
It is, and you know, I have, as I mentioned, let's go behind closed doors and get to 218. One of my internal rule changes I propose is let's make sure we have the votes in conference before we go to the House floor. It's silly. We're just putting ourselves in a vulnerable situation otherwise. The other rule change I've asked for is I think Congress should work 40 hours a week when we're in session. If we're in D.C., let's go in session Monday morning at 9 a.m. and leave Friday at 6 p.m. like everybody else in the country does. Here we come up, we're here for 2.5, 3 days. The agenda's already set. We get very little done. How will we ever address tax reform and immigration, border security, transportation, whether or not we agree with the president's foreign policy in the Middle East? Where are we on that debate? We're completely silent on all of this. Let's be in session more. Give voice to the American people on some of the hardest issues we face today as opposed to doing nothing on them.
Charleston, West Virginia. Mark, independent caller. Hi, Mark.
Hi, how are you today? Thanks for taking my call. I have a great concern about Paul Ryan being Speaker of the House. I know when people say things publicly, what they feel in their heart may be something completely different. But Paul Ryan publicly stated that the most influential factor in his political thinking is the writings of Ayn Rand. And this is an ancient history. He said this just a few years ago. And a lot of people don't realize that Ayn Rand was a elitist aristocrat whose family was ousted from Russia after the communists took over, and her basic thinking is that and she's publicly said this. First of all, she's an atheist. Second of all, she's publicly stated that the rich are rich because somehow they're genetically superior and they deserve to be rich, and that the poor are poor because they're, not as evolved than just dirt.
So,
and
Mark, do you have a question here for the congressman then?
Yeah, how can you even think about making this man, who is maybe a 2 degrees short of a Nazi, if he means what he says, that those are the most influential thing in his political thinking is the writings of Ayn Rand. How can you guys even think about electing him? Or maybe that's exactly the
Okay,
way
Mark, I think we got your point.
Sure. So, Mark, obviously I can't speak for Paul Ryan's comment on this. Here's what I know. Paul Ryan is an intellectual conservative committed to governing and empowering every individual from every walk of life to create their own potential and their own success. Listen, he believes in very conservative principles, as I do and as our party does. That is at great odds, as I mentioned earlier, with a party whose current presidential frontrunner in New Hampshire is a registered socialist. We have two very different views of how to invest in the power of every human being in this country, how to provide for the future of our country, the fabric of our communities. We have very different political philosophies between conservatives and progressives. Paul Ryan, as I do, believes that the conservative principles of less regulation, less government, less taxes, more individual freedom are right for the future of the country.
We're talking with Representative David Jolly, Republican of Florida, represents the 13th District. He's running for the Senate seat being vacated by his Republican colleague, Marco Rubio. He's not in it alone, though.
That's
you
right.
have a primary
That's
challenge
right.
with second-term Representative Ron DeSantis, who is from the state's northeast coast, and then you've got
That's
two
right.
Democrats running for it as well. You've got Representative Alan Grayson, who said that he would challenge Representative Patrick Murphy in that Democratic primary. Jim, Spring Hill, Florida, Republican. Hi, Jim. Jim, good morning to you. It's Spring Hill, Florida. You're on the air.
Congressman.
Hey, Jim, how you doing?
Yes, I could be better, but in all the conversation as a registered Republican, I hear about entitlement reforms, and when you say entitlement, to me, it's like you're giving something away, but the fact is that all of those people worked for Social Security.
It's all earned. You're exactly right.
We paid those monies in decades and decades ago, and you're making it look like it's some kind of a handout, rather than what we're getting back the loans, the bad loans, in fact, that we made to various administrations that mismanaged these monies. I mean, I just heard that Butterfield himself, Nixon's aide, said that all the bombing in Vietnam was a mistake. So Vietnam's a mistake. All of a sudden it occurs in the primary that Iraq's a mistake. Perhaps even Afghanistan was a mistake. Now, we're paying for all these mistakes, and you guys say that we're getting money for nothing, because I was working when all this stuff started. We're getting money for nothing off of the government and the rich guys. Well, why don't you just raise the rate?
All right, Jim, let's hear from the congressman.
Yeah, so thank you. And listen, I agree with you. Entitlement is a term that's a misnomer, that is a term of Washington, and I should use it less. It's a policy wonk term. You're exactly right. These are earned benefits that individuals have paid into. You know, the Supreme Court has ruled in the past that individuals don't have a property right in Social Security. I disagree with that. I believe it is a property right. I can tell you this, and I was one of the very few Republicans who have continually voted against our Republican budget, Paul Ryan's budget, in fact, because I disagree with some of the very aggressive reforms to spending when it comes to Medicare and Social Security, because it would disrupt the financial plans of many people like yourself. I think we can embrace many of the reforms that we know are going to be needed, but do it for a much younger age, much younger generation, for those perhaps who have not yet entered the workforce, that will be able to know actuarially that it will actually be there for them. You know, my struggle with our current budget resolution that Republicans continue to pass, they come home and they say, we voted to balance the budget. But it's as though we stopped short. It's as though we left the field in the 8th inning of a baseball game with the lead and we declared victory. The fact is, if we don't get it over the finish line, reach consensus with the White House to actually enact these reforms, we've actually done nothing to address it. I think we can protect Social Security and Medicare for people currently in the workforce, achieve long-term reforms that actually get us back to balance.
The folks in Florida are watching this morning. We're going to
Sure
get
they
one
are,
more
they are.
from Fort Myers. Susan,
All right.
an independent.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for taking my
Good
call.
morning.
One comment and one suggestion. I thought it was interesting that when Paul Ryan was setting his agenda on what he would do and what he wouldn't, that he wanted to spend more time with his family. That's really nice. But, you know, the rest of us on Main Street do not have that luxury to even bring that up to any employer. The second thing, I agree with the gentleman ahead of me about Social Security. If you folks are really interested in keeping Social Security and Medicare solvent, this should be made dedicated funds so none of you can get your hands on it to reappropriate the money for something else.
I fully agree with you. You're exactly right. Listen, I was home this weekend. I'm home every weekend, and a man came up to me at the Clearwater Jazz Fest, standing in line for a drink, and he said, "Please don't let Congress take away my Social Security and Medicare." And I said, "Not on my watch. I'm not going to let it happen." Listen, it is a hard vote as a Republican to be in the well of the House voting against your own party's budget, but I do so out of conviction. We have people who have paid into a system, who have rightfully earned that benefit and deserve that benefit to be there. I am never going to do anything that reduces the right to that benefit that people have paid into.
What has Daniel Webster told you and other supporters about his plan for the continuing resolution? Here's Politico story this morning. Right. Welcome to CR hell. It looks like a crisis averted, but inside government, continuing resolution creates a wasteful Netherland of its own. Another deadline coming up on this.
Sure. Listen, when we govern by CRs, conservatives lose, and we ultimately drive up the long-term costs of governing. We hurt private sector job growth for those who provide critical technology and equipment to the Department of Defense, small businesses in my district that do that. Here's why I supported Dan Webster early. Among all the candidates for every leadership position, you know, rewind about 6 weeks ago, there were 10 or 12 people running for different offices. There were only 2 people who articulated an actual plan to avoid ever getting into a CR situation: Dan Webster and Dennis Ross. Dan Webster has a vision of negotiating appropriations bills with the White House in July, 8 weeks ahead of September 30th, taking all the leverage away from the White House to be able to suggest Republicans are shutting down the government. If we actually get back to governing, do the people's work in a responsible, timely fashion, go into session 5 days a week, work 40 hours a week, get our work done by summer, we will forever take off the table this notion of a government shutdown in a CR. When Dan articulated that, he had my support. And understand, our votes are different. And I said this about Paul Ryan. We're never going to agree on everything, right? This is not, for me, an ideological litmus test. This is a leadership test. Dan Webster has articulated a vision of leadership that I believe is right for our conference.
All right, David Jolly, thank you very much for being here and
Thank you
talking
for
to
having
our
me. I
callers
appreciate
this
it.
morning. Appreciate
All right.
it. Coming up next, we're going to